People wonder what the true status of the embryo is, and whether or not it has the same rights as humans in certain situations, for example, abortion. Abortion is the removal of an embryo from the uterus in order to prevent pregnancy. There are three common responses to this topic. First, some may say that the embryo is simply a mass of cells and is part of the mother's body. Some also may say the embryo cannot be considered human life because the embryo does not look or act like functioning human beings we see in everyday life. However, scientists respond to these statements by stating that the embryo is not part of the mother's body. In fact, it has its own DNA, which makes the embryo its own separate being. Also, the embryo uses its mother's nutrients to develop, but the embryo itself is forming its own organs and continuing to grow. Secondly, some also say that the embryo is a human person from the time of its conception. In response, scientists say that the embryo is indivisible for up to 14 days, which means one cannot consider the embryo to be an individual being at the time of its conception. This explanation is known as the biological objection. Some scientists also might say that the embryo belongs to the human species, but cannot be considered a human person because interpersonal relationships are absent. This explanation is known as the anthropological objection. Lastly, some say it is impossible to know the precise moment when the embryo will become a person. However, philosophers believe when the embryo develops a brainstem, can no longer divide, or when the mother chooses to enter a relationship with the embryo, is when ensoulment occurs. Ensoulment is when the embryo receives its soul from God. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, aka the CTF, states that the human being is to be respected and treated as a person from the moment of conception, and that humans contain ethical status from the moment of conception to their death. The Church does not state that the embryo is a human person, but the embryo should be treated as a human person. There are two difficulties surrounding when exactly the precise post-conception point when the embryo can be considered a human person is. The first difficulty is the human development process is continuous, so it is impossible to determine when human personhood begins. And the second difficulty is the belief that the embryo should not be respected until that threshold is attained. The Catholic Church does not have a specific position on this topic as a whole, but they have stated that the embryo is distinct to human life, and it should be able to have the same rights as human people.